today we are talking about space. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge this space, the very space I'm standing in right now. I am in Vancouver, so I am on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Suquamish people, and I would like to thank them for their hospitality. When thinking of space and culture, the very first thing I would like you to do today is to close your eyes and just for a moment and think of your favorite place. What does it look like? And how does it feel like? For example, how does it smell? How does it feel being there? What kind of textures are there? Is it hot? Is it cold? Perhaps there are stories or events that you associate with that place. And think who is there with you. Why do you like it? Anthropologists have always been really interested in how people in different cultures, communities, and societies create, organize, think about, value, understand, and give meaning to places. This is because place, just like time, is a key dimension and aspect of human experience, and also a key referent for culture. Already in 1940s, British anthropologist Edward Evans Pritchard was interested in how space is constructed in different contexts and different cultures. So in the first part of his ethnography called the Nuer, in which he described what he learned from living and traveling with Nuer communities in South Sudan, he describes Nuerland with these words. From a European point of view, Nuerland has no favorable qualities unless its severity be counted as such, for its endless marshes and wide savanna plains have an austere, monotonous charm. It is throughout hard on man and beast, being for most of the year either parched or a swamp. But Nuer think that they live on the finest country on earth, and it must be admitted, for herdsmen their country has many admirable features. I soon gave up trying to convince Nuer that there is any country more suited for cattle husbandry than their own, for it is a very strong opinion that their land is superior to ours. And note here that Evans Pritchard could have simply written, the land of the Nuer is horrible. Or he could have simply written, the Nuer really love their country. So it is this bringing together of two very different perspectives and the surprising difference between them that makes this quote interesting to us, even so long time ago after it was written. So Evans Pritchard's description is interesting in many different ways. First of all, it poses as a puzzle. How could the same land look so different to Evans Pritchard than to, say, Kuol, a youth he was working with in 1939? And the very first simple answer to this question is culture. Culture and the way a society is organized helps us give meaning to space. Culture helps us see what is beautiful and what is valuable. It helps us know and decide what is appropriate to do in a particular space and what is not. And it also decides who is excluded from certain places and who can claim certain spaces as their own or be comfortable in certain spaces. Culture even shapes our ideas of what counts as near and what counts as far. In turn, our relationship with space also shapes our language, our culture, the way we organize a society, and the relations we have with others. So returning for a moment to Evans Pritchard's contradictory description of Nuerland, the Nuer, as you see in these older photos, were in 1940s and still are pastoralists. What it means is that society, their economy, their spirituality, even their language and the social relation revolved around raising cows. So cows are really important in Nuer societies, and we will talk a little bit more about different economic systems in society in one of the next weeks when we talk about making a living. So the fact that they were pastoralists and that their society revolved around cows is very important to understand the view of space and their view of the landscape they live in the eyes of the Nuer. In fact, when describing their land, the Nuer would have probably not used at all the words of the words of Evans Pritchard. Rather than saying that their land is either flooded or it is parched, they probably would have pointed out that the floods are so important because they bring water for people and cows, and that it doesn't reach the top of the ridges where Nuer at the time built villages to be safe from the floods. And rather than parched, they might have pointed out that water recedes, allowing them to travel. New grass brings food for their herds, and the young people can travel and gather in large camps and socialize. And this is just a starting point. There are many other questions that we can think starting from this difference between these two perceptions of space, from this contradiction, let's say. For one, this stark difference between the two descriptions can help us question the position of Evans Pritchard. So to say it simply, it tells us about Nuer ideas about space as much as it tells us about Evans Pritchard's ideas about land and space. Thinking back to the place you imagined at the very beginning, when I asked you to close your eyes for a minute, think about this. How would somebody who is not familiar at all with the location you had in mind describe it? Which words would they use, and how would they be different from words that you might use to describe your favorite place? And importantly also, how would you feel about this difference if they described it in a completely different way that perhaps would not capture what is important to you in this space and how you came to appreciate it over time? To now, anthropologists have been more and more reflexive of how their ways of thinking and the social position influence the questions they ask in their research, and also the perspective they adopt and the way they write about other people's ideas, whether they represent them accurately and what are the complexities and intricacy of doing so. It is important here to know that at the time when Evans Pritchard was in Nuerland, in South Sudan, at the time, Nuerland was under the colonial government of the British. And in fact, shortly before his fieldwork, the British Army, as Hutchinson tells us, has just captured or killed many of the Nuer prophets or religious leaders in an effort to pacify the Nuer, in an effort to gain control over the land. So a very important question we can ask is, how did this particular depiction of space and also of Nuer interest then intersect with colonial ideas, with colonial practices and colonial interests at the time? So although these quotes that we have listened to is very old, it's almost 100 years old, different claims to spaces and resources are still really significant in the land of the Nuer today. As Hutchinson explains, for example, the decades-long conflict that has been happening in South Sudan are in part due to the resources that are in the land. The fact that the traditional Nuer territory is very rich in oil, for example, and that is also strategically located around the White Nile Basin and extending into Ethiopia. So different claims to spaces and the resource of spaces, and even different ways of understanding who owns or who's entitled to resources and which spaces fuel still conflicts today, not very differently from the conflicts that were happening at the time of Evans Pritchard. So another different set of questions we can also ask regarding differences within newer society. Generally, it was newer men who held cows and who held herds and who were most interested in cattle herding. But another questions we could ask that Evans Pritchard did not really ask at the time was, what would women say about their land? What kind of descriptions would, for example, women come up, newer women come up about their land and what is valuable to them, what is beautiful to them? We could also ask, what about differences between older people and younger people? What about rural Nuer and Nuers that have settled in cities, for example, Nuer living in Khartoum? What about also the influences of these decade-long conflicts on the very ideas of space? How did the war perhaps change the way Nuer use space and the Nuer think about space? So if culture gives meaning to space, as we have said so far, we also have to remember that all cultures are shaped around different unequal power relations. So all cultures in society are shaped by an equal power relation, and space is an important way of shaping unequal power relation. So to say it in a word or in a sentence, who creates spaces and how really matters. One way of saying this is with this quote that you can see on the screen. It is a quote by Henry Lefebvre, who was not an anthropologist, but who spent most of his time, like academic time, thinking about the relationship between space, culture, and power. And he writes, space is permeated with social relations. So it's filled with social relations. It is producing and produced by social relations. So you have a sort of a cycle, right? Certain power relations in society shape space, and in turn, the resulting space serves to maintain, recreate, and strengthen the same social relations. In fact, Henry Lefebvre goes so far as to say that every society creates its own space, and a movement or historical movement that fails to do so is inevitably ephemeral and ultimately unsuccessful. Now, I would like to talk about a different example on space and the creation of space and why it matters. I want to discuss an example given by Edward Doolittle in a book called, actually subtitled, Geographies of Liberation. It's a book of 2018. Doolittle is a Mohawk from Six Nations, and he's also a mathematician. And I heard him talk about space in a mathematics symposium organized at UBC. And one of the things that he argues is that the grid, as you can see here, for example, the grid has been a privileged way for North American settler society to imagine, to represent, and to organize space. Like all cultural constructions, the grid, as a culturally specific way to relate to space, does several things. First of all, it fosters a particular understanding. So it enables certain ideas about space. It makes us see space in a certain way. Secondly, it blinds us to alternative ways of seeing space. And as such, it has particular consequences. In the words of Doolittle, the grid's common use in the dominant culture leads to familiarity and comfort. So it's very easy for us to use a grid because we're so used to it. We know well the benefits of using the grid, but what are the dangers? When and how does a grid fail? What are the consequences of the failure, and what are the alternatives? And I really love his questions, really helping us to see that each way of understanding space and representing space has advantages and disadvantages that have to be taken seriously because they have consequences. So the grid, as Doolittle says, it's very handy in a certain respect. And I put the map just because, that is one of the handy things of the grid. Whenever I want to go somewhere, I look up at the map and I can travel around the grid, right? So the grid gives us a sense of human control over land and nature. And Singh says that this sense of control over land and nature is particularly evident in large-scale agriculture, where the grid actually helps to transform forests and land into rows of planted trees and vegetables for near and distant markets. And just so this is the space of the plantation, for example, this is the space of the monocrop, is certainly a grid. But if you think about it, so many things in our society are organized like a grid. Like even if you go to the market, the produce are arranged on shelves or on a stall, usually in the grid. We sit in grids when we are in classrooms. If you start thinking about it, you will see really the grid everywhere. But what are some of the dangers and the failures of the grid? Doolittle writes that the grid and its mathematical foundation in Cartesian coordinates assumes that all places are the same and that they can fit on the grid. So it reduces places, in a sense, to interchangeable, measurable parcels. In this way, of course, the grid erases particular understanding, particular stories that are associated with places, relationships that to the land and relationships to particular spaces, spiritual aspects of the land and ways of knowing place that are different and measuring and mapping distances. Importantly, both Doolittle and Singh write that while many of us take the grid for granted and commonsensical just because we encounter it so much in everyday life, using the grid as a main way of relating to and organizing space takes really hard work. It is actually a cultural, political, and social work that we're doing. It's not just obvious using the grid. Because the grid, when actually applied to the spaces we inhabit, does not work very well and needs all kinds of adjustments. Here, what you see is a map of the world, but as I'm sure you all know, each flat map, each flat grid of the world runs into the problem that it cannot really well represent the spherical shape of our world. That is like one difficulty, for example, of using the grid in representing the world. And so, it takes a lot of adjustments. Another interesting example that Doolittle says is that in Hamilton, where he grew up, if you just follow the grid system of the road, you would actually fall 100 meters to the street below, as the grid actually hides and flattens the Niagara Escarpment that crosses the city. He also says that his reserve, Six Nations, is situated at the meeting point, at the confluence of multiple incompatible grids. And so when someone drives into the reserve, they immediately get confused and lost. So the fact that grids are not simply out there as the best and most obvious way to think of spaces, but that it requires work also reminds us that culture is not just something in our head, but it's actually an active process. Culture is an ever-changing practice of understanding the world, of relating to others. Here, of understanding, representing, and relating to space. To help us think of the grid and its failures as well as its alternative, Dolittle poses us a mathematical puzzle, which is called the Königsberg Bridges problem. Elle wants to know if you can find a way to take a walk which crosses each bridge exactly once. And this problem is based on the city of Königsberg that has a river and several bridges over the river. There is actually no solution to the puzzle as it is posed. So it is impossible to do this, to cross each bridge exactly once and crossing all the bridges. In fact, I kind of tricked you a little bit here because this is, says Dolittle, who is a mathematician, a 300 years old mathematical problem that has no solution. Or even better, it's a problem that has been proven to be impossible to solve. You can see that, what is really odd is that the river is contained in the space of the city and its bridges. Dolittle suggests that we all learn from Mohawk ways of thinking about territories and land and ways of thinking about rivers. He says that instead of being so obsessed with the grid, Mohawks have been using the idea of a watershed or a drainage basin, especially in the particular case, the watershed of the Grand River that defines the traditional territory. And here the point is that using the watershed is an embodied and place-based way of thinking about space, because rather than being based on abstract measurements from a disembodied distance, for example, from the aerial view, like in this map, it refers to people on a very particular land. Reflecting on the Mohawk territory on the drainage basin of the rivershed of the Grand River, Dolittle explains, consider a point on the land and then take a glass of water and pour it onto that point. The water from that glass will eventually flow to the sea. If it does so by way of the Grand River, he writes, the point at which we started is part of the Grand River drainage basin. So basically the advantage of using a watershed perspective in looking at rivers in space in space is that you can always tell where you are in a very embodied way. You can actually see where the water is going when you pour water onto the land. Of course, it's a bit hard to see if we really have a glass of water, but as a way of thinking, right? And when we look now back at the Königsberg puzzle, I said that what it is odd is that the river is all contained in the space of the city and its bridges. So we have put the river inside a grid, basically. And if we abandon the grid for a moment, we abandon the grid of the town, the grid of the bridges, the grid of a problem, and we think about the watershed, then we could approach the river in a very different way. And we could solve the problem thinking of a different way of thinking about space. Dolittle says that we could actually cross one of the bridges once, then walk all the way to the source of the river, and then we can make an offering over there, walk down the other bank, and then continue to cross bridges until all have been crossed. Importantly, in his article, Dolittle says that this solution does not come from an abstract way of thinking about the river as a watershed, because again, that would be, as he says, a settler's way of understanding space. Like there is a very disembodied way of thinking about watershed as well and measuring watershed as well. This is not really what he's after. Rather, he's thinking about crossing the river in different points, and thinking about the river as a watershed comes from actions towards the river, comes from a relationship and responsibilities that link people to space, to land, and to water. He said that he thought about the solution because he started asking himself, what haven't we done that we should have done? What is missing in this problem? And he said, well, what is not part of this problem but should be there is that we have not given thanks to the river. Then the next question is like, how should we give thanks? To what should we give thanks? To the river Prigel, and how should we give thanks to the river? And, a way of giving thanks to the river is making an offering, and this offering should be placed at the source of the river. So what I want you to notice here in Dolittle's thinking is that thinking about the watershed in this way, again, is not a disembodied representation of a watershed as another map on the land, but rather is a way of thinking about the watershed as a system of relationship, gratitude to the water, responsibility towards the water, and also a knowledge of a watershed that comes from having traveled there, having lived there, and having learned about it. So the Dolittle example, like it's easy to say, oh, this is all very cute, and now we know how to solve this puzzle by tricking the puzzle and thinking about watershed instead. But the Dolittle example is important because it's much more than a fun riddle about bridges. The cultures of the grids have very important consequences. And here we should really think that grids have been instrument. We should remember that grids have been instrument in colonial measurement, colonial control of the land, and colonial dispossession of indigenous land all over the continent. And that's why this exercise is more than just having fun with bridges. Particular ways of understanding spaces, in fact, have consequences. And this is the case especially for the Mohawk territory around the Grand River. Dolittle recounts that the first step of the dispossession, of the historical dispossession of the Mohawk and of Six Nations has been to reduce the Mohawk ideas of the watershed to a 3-mile narrow ribbon on each side of the river. So that was the first step in dispossession. The second step has been to transform the irregular edges of this 3-mile corridor into a straight line. And note here that this is literally putting the river inside the grid. The next step then was to divide this territory into pieces, and then to dispossess the Mohawk people and the Haudenosaunee people of the Confederacy of the land one piece at a time. And the result of all of this process of measuring, putting things in grids, parceling it out, and then selling it off, or claiming it and dispossessing the original inhabitants, has been the Six Nations Reserve that you can see in this picture is much, much smaller than the ribbon around the river and then the wider watershed. So Dolittle writes that the Six Nations Reserve is now only about 3% of the original Haldimand deed, which was already smaller than the Grand River drainage basin. if we go back to the anthropologist and ideas about space, the job of the anthropologist then in regards to space is not just to point out particular ways in which society think about space, constitute space, and imagine space, but also to ask how are these views and practices constituted through historical, cultural, and political processes. Basically, who participates in thinking about space in a particular way, and what are the consequences? Who benefits from it? Who, instead of benefiting from it, is perhaps excluded from place? Who is perhaps dispossessed from place? So this is very important because, again, it reminds us that any cultural way of thinking about certain ideas is also created and lives within particular power relations, and that is always part of our analysis as well. So all of this is also important for considering another very interesting idea or set of ideas when we talk about space, which is borders. Now, we all know about borders. Borders are another very important way in which cultures and society organize and constitute space. And here I would like you to think for just a few moments, what comes to your mind when you think about borders? How are borders created? What are your experiences of crossing borders? Why are they so important in our contemporary world? And here, of course, you can also think about how COVID has changed borders, right? Like we used to be able to go to the States, for example, very easily, or at least some of us were able to go to the States very easily. Of course, for some, that has never been easy. But now the borders has dramatically changed with COVID, and some borders have become even more impassable than before. Borders, in fact, are a very important way in which culture and society organize and constitute spaces. And the thing about borders is that they define who belongs in certain places and who doesn't. And by doing so, borders inscribe social hierarchies and inequalities into space. And they do that both in very material ways, but also some subtle ways. So sometimes there are even borders between villages, and borders are important because they are often a zone of violence, and often they are disputed as well. And here I want to just refer to some scholars who complicate this idea of borders and also complicate the idea of space. So the first one I want to think about is what Eising and Rigel write. They write that there are no longer just borders between states or countries, but in the past 10 years, there have been a proliferation of spaces. They call them zone, areas, or pockets that are not borders themselves, but act like one. And more precisely, these spaces act in conjunction with borders, either because they extend the border, or they reinforce the border, or because they create a kind of black holes within normal existing territories, regions, and cities. Eising and Rigel call these areas of containment because their main function is to hold migrant and refugees and to control them. Basically, they are places for which marginalized subjects are managed and controlled. And here you have a visual depiction of some of these spaces. While this map that comes from Migreurope, Europe, which is an organization for the rights of migrants and refugees, is from 2016. So this is a little bit of an older map. Still, it points to something that continues to be really relevant in the world today. And as you can see here, there are detention zone. There are like these pockets of borders of these different kinds of borders that are also within regular territories, come in different forms. Some are migrants and refugees camps, some are detention zones, some are offshore detention centers and prison-like facilities in cities and sometimes even in the countryside. And what they have in common is that they are talked about as zones of protection, but actually they are instruments, as I said before, they're instruments of control and surveillance. They also criminalize migrants because they hold them in prison-like facilities. And so they both derive from and also they reinforce the notion that migrants are dangerous, they are criminal, they are invaders, and that they need to be controlled.